Now, I just want to mention some of my motivation for coming here as well, because I just want to say that I think it is it's awful to experience this tension that we see in Europe now, and also between Norway, Western Europe, and a neighboring country, Russia. It's something that I find extremely difficult to accept, and this is also one of the reasons why I hope to send students to Russia. And we have one of my former Prime Minister is Jens Stoltenberg is the NATO leader, and it's still that hasn't helped much. And today we had in the news a Norwegian spy, a guy who was a courier for the Norwegian intelligence services, who was actually found responsible. Well, he is charged in Russia for that, and that doesn't help in this situation either. So this is the situation with the. I find it's extremely difficult to contribute to dialogue and education across borders for a common understanding. So that was my background for coming here, actually, to accepting this nice invitation. Now, I will be talking about the mechanisms of corruption primarily, and in a simple way. So I will begin by saying something general about corruption, how we can understand this as a phenomenon, how we can understand it, how I think we can understand it in your region, and then you have to correct me. And I will also say something about what how foreign players can contribute, and what we can do, and that's something I really want to discuss with you and hear your views about. Now, so corruption. Let's go through that. I have made a number listed a number of mechanisms here. Of course, everybody knows that corruption leads to unfair allocation of benefits in society. It's not those who deserve it the most who get the benefit, it's those who pay the bribes. That's quite obvious. It leads to theft of state revenues, and also when we look at Russia, we see that there is huge revenues being brought out of the country to tax havens and hidden. But this is actually quite serious. I would call it theft rather than corruption, but it's a problem that is under the corruption umbrella. When we have politicians or high-ranking government officials who steal, we call it corruption, even if there's not necessarily several parties involved. A very important consequence is also the way corruption distorts markets. It alters the decisions away from the best price-quality combination. So the whole purpose of competition, of course, is to make sure that we encourage innovation, that we encourage good quality, best value for public money. That's the whole idea. Corruption distorts that, and it allocates contracts towards the best bidder instead of the best price-quality combination. And then you have to keep in mind that when there is corruption, they negotiate the terms. It's not only the contract that is moved from one supplier to another, the terms are different as well. Because when it's not the best price quality that is the most important for those who allocate the contracts, it's possible for those involved to influence the terms of the contract as well. So, and this is, of course, especially a problem in public procurement, but it is also a problem in private corruption, when you consider totally commercial circumstances. So in my work, I focus primarily on corruption involving government institutions in one way or the other, but many of the problems apply also for private situations. Now, and this thing that companies also, those who operate honestly, both individuals and companies, receive lower returns from their innovation and investments. This is quite important, because if you think at the level of the individual, if you have a talented individual, a young guy or woman must decide whether to to operate, to work in something productive, innovative, or so on, or they can, if they can choose to operate corruptly, they don't need to care about production, but they can perhaps profit more by being corrupt. This is a huge problem in many countries where we see that productive individuals can gain more through corruption than productive activities, and this is extremely damaging for society. Corruption, when it is harms the quality, of course this is part of the distortions, but it is really a separate problem that buildings can be of lower quality. They can actually fall apart because of corruption. We see that when we look at the studies showing what buildings fall apart when there is an earthquake. And that's typically buildings where there has been some kind of suspected corruption. And infrastructure, so I said I have been working a lot in African countries, and it is really a problem that the quality of roads is so bad, they have to be renewed the next year after they have been built. And utility provision in general, and by utility provision I'm referring to water, electricity, telecoms, you know, these basic services that have to be in place in a society. The quality of those services are worse in areas where we have high-level corruption. It really distorts the function because, of course, companies don't need to care that much about quality if they can bribe those who control the functions of those services. Now, another different mechanisms is that recruitment to political and government position. This alone, of course, is a serious problem in a society. Of course, we can have less competent leaders, less competent government officials as a result. But also, we can have doctors who are not really doctors, or we can have auditors who got the job not because of their competence, but because of the bribe they paid. And that harms so many functions in a society. So that is also a separate consequence. But I have some more. Let me see. Yes. What we also see that corruption facilitates other forms of crime. It makes it easier to launder money, of course, but also tax evasion and terrorism. There is a book where they have an author, an American author who did a study of all the largest terrorist attacks after 11 September, and she found that corruption had played a very important part in the planning, in the smuggling of weapons, and so on. And so this is actually a concern as well. And of course, for various citizens, more corruption for utilities, etc., means more expenses. They have to pay more. That can be a tax. It can feel like a tax if you get what you want with this payment. Now, demotivation of investment, that is something that Torbjørn Becker touched upon when he said property rights, that the corruption may reduce the protection of property rights. But this happens in several ways, and of course foreign investors are also extremely worried about being held liable for corruption, which is a serious concern, especially for those that are listed in the US stock exchange. Now, and of course all of this sums up to lower trust in government and lower recognition for the rule of law. And for citizens, they may feel, well, if others are corrupt, why should I obey the law? And then there you go with the problem of law enforcement generally. Now, of course, all these mechanisms are not equally harmful, and they are not equally present. In the policy world, World Bank, the OECD, and so on, they want researchers like me to put a figure on the cost of corruption. But if you look at these different consequences, it is impossible to put a figure, a number, on the consequences of corruption. And Torbjørn Becker mentioned this morning that what drives development is certain industries, it's trade and so on, and the oil price is extremely important, and that of course is correct, but there's also a very strong correlation between development and corruption. Now, if we consider the term corruption, that term contains reference to very, very different problems. We have the small bribes people pay to get electricity, to the highest grand corruption at the political level, and we have the same word for it. Well, of course, there's also many other words, but this word corruption is supposed to contain all of that. So this is not one phenomenon. But to the extent that we try to find a common denominator, we can think of corruption. For my sake, I use the definition a trade in decisions that should not be for sale. Because this element of a bargain is essential for analytically understanding what happens. So there are two players involved. We can think of corruption as a deal between two players in a more or less asymmetric relationship. The advantage of considering corruption a deal is the fact that we are quickly forced to think about the bargaining powers of those involved. And you can imagine if this bargaining power between the two players are very asymmetric, for example, which means that I have a lot of authority, but you are in a very weak position. That means I can very easily extort you. I can take bribes very easily. If this allocation of bargaining powers is symmetric, which means that we are in kind of equal standing, we have collusion. And that means that there's not the same element of extortion, so it's not the same form of pressure, and both players have a much stronger incentive to keep the problem hidden. So what do you think is the easiest to get rid of? The extortive forms of corruption or the collusive forms of corruption? Am I permitted to ask that question even if we have not got to the questions? Well, what would you think? I just need to get some reactions here. What would be the easiest to get rid of if you were a government? The extortive forms of corruption or the collusive forms of corruption? Anyone who has an idea? If you think of this as a deal.
Пожалуйста, коллеги, 2-3 комментария. Кто? Представляйтесь.
Я думаю, что проще называется вымогательство, потому что Антон Веселов, Новосибирск, потому что другой вариант – это участие двух сторон в равной степени заинтересованных в результате.
Еще?
Yes. Well, that is actually right. That extortion is much easier to get rid of. There are some exceptions. For example, the situations when you have a mafia organization putting pressure on a judge and offering not only a bribe, but also the offer of not being violent. You know, that is a situation that is not so easy to get rid of. But generally, we see that in countries all over the world, we see that as income levels increases, they quickly get rid of the extortive forms of corruption, but the collusive forms of corruption often remains. And that is also, I will get to your region in a little while, but that is also what we see in your region, that the visible forms of corruption, all those situations when police, customers and so on take bribes, they are on the decline. They are more and more getting rid of those, and we have the big problems remaining. And you can also think of how easy it is to get those who are extorted, those who are have been in a sense forced to pay a bribe, how easy it is to get them to report it if they can safely tell somebody that they were forced to pay a bribes and without facing sanctions. If it is possible to create such an opportunity and reduce the problem and make it much less safe for those who demand bribes. Now, I know that it sounds easier than it is in practice, but it is actually easier to get away with extortion because those involved have a different interest in keeping the problem hidden. Now, in terms of understanding corruption, we have to think about two factors. So if we want to have a framework for understanding corrupt situations, the risks and the consequences, there are especially two factors that are important to understand. And these are, the first is what kind of allocation mechanisms that apply for the public benefits in question. Are the public benefits in question allocated upon some form of evaluation of qualifications or not? That's one aspect. And if you compare the situation whether you are accepting kids in elementary school or if you are accepting public procurement contracts, complex contracts, you see the difference right away. The other factor you have to consider is scarcity, whether the benefit is something that is supposed to be available for all, or whether it is a scarce benefit that never can be available for all. And of course, building permits in a city will be scarce. And this access that I mentioned to elementary school will normally be plenty. And but these two factors, the form of allocation mechanism, how is it decided who gets what? That is one, and the other is how plenty is the benefit. These two factors are essential for understanding both the risk of corruption and its consequences. Because in a situation when you have plenty of the public benefit in question that people may want to bribe for, in those situations, the ones who control them cannot take very high bribes because they will easily get the benefit in any case. In situations when there's a scarce benefit, the bribes can be much higher, and also the distortions can be higher the more discretion the decision maker has. So I will not spend time on this, but I just want you to reflect a little bit about this kind of analytic approach to the problem. And once you have started to think about it, you will use it. And when you see the problem in your own society, you will start reflecting about what kind of benefit is this? How is it allocated? What kind of distortion will it lead to, and so on. And that will help you understand the problem. Now, and I just want to mention that I was part of a G20 process, and where Russia was involved, and Russia asked for. It was for a study on the consequences of corruption. That project had never started unless the Putin administration had asked for it. They wanted to have estimates of the consequences of corruption. And as I mentioned, I did not want to provide measures of something so. I didn't want to provide estimated figures of the consequences, but I wanted to explain the consequences, and that's why I was coordinating a group of researchers who did this report where we compare the consequences of corruption in 4 sectors: infrastructure, oil and gas, non-renewable resources, health and education. And in that study we did a literature review across this, using this framework that I mentioned, with the scarcity, the form of authority, what kind of distortions and so on, and we studied those distortions as a result of corruption in 4 sectors. But that was not on Russia, but it was motivated by this call from Russia. And it led to certain principles on corruption. Now, so I have been talking now so far about mechanisms, but we also have legal definitions. And that is extremely important because what is defined by law is very important as a signal to people, as a kind of promoting the moral development in society. But it is also necessary in order to clarify what is blameworthy and when there should be an enforcement action. Now, there are some, well, yes, I just want to mention also that once we talk about individuals, countries, companies, we should keep in mind that there is a legal definition. There is, if people are not, we simply cannot call people or countries or companies corrupt if we don't have any idea about evidence. Because in most countries, corruption is criminally defined. That is a bit complicated because the law will not necessarily match what citizens think of corruption. And in some countries, we see that the definition of corruption has actually been influenced by those who may benefit from grabbing, because they have changed the law. So what they do is not necessarily corruption by law, but it is a form of grabbing that resembles very much what citizens may think of as corruption. So, so that makes it very difficult to use the term corruption. So in some settings, for me, it's easier to talk about grabbing because I talk about companies and countries so often, and we don't necessarily, it has to be judged by a court to this or an enforcement process to decide what's corruption. And in Russia, when I have a quick look at Russia, I see that Russia has signed and implemented important conventions against corruption. Corruption is criminalized, like in most other countries. And I also see, simply looking at all the statistics that we do have now, that Russia has got rid of many forms of corruption as well. And still, what I also see when I look at various forms of indicators is that corruption has some serious corruption problems. And I will turn a little bit to those, and now I'm moving into challenging terrain with all these experts in the room. So, yes, for example, Transparency International says that every third Russian has paid a bribe. And this there are many organizations that map perceptions about corruption, ask people how often they paid bribes and so on. So there's a lot of information indicating corruption of various forms. Now, what I wanted to go a little bit into is this thing, whether there is something called post-communist corruption, because this has been quite, it has been discussed quite a bit in the literature, as if nearly as if there is a curse from the Soviet period, which I don't think there is. Because when I look at this, is only for the Transparency International, probably familiar for you. What I see is that there's, first of all, huge variation in the region. So in some countries have actually improved substantially on corruption, and there's huge differences because the problem take different forms in different countries. And there are many reforms that go in the right direction, as I will come to soon. Now, but this thing, I think it makes sense to ask whether there is a common legacy in the region, whether there is some historic factors that contribute to explain problems that we see today. And this, of course, is something that many authors have written about, and here I will give my interpretation, so you can comment afterwards if you think I am on the right track or not. Now, so I think this framework that I mentioned, how to understand corruption as a deal and asymmetric, symmetric bargaining powers, scarce resources, form of authority, that framework certainly applies to what you observe in Russia and neighboring countries. But there is something about the history that may contribute to make it easier to understand today's challenges. So this thing that political reform happened in high speed when the Berlin Wall fell. This was not a planned economic reform, and it happened so quickly. And there was a lack of structures and institutions for a market economy. That's obvious to everybody. That was it didn't change for the sake of changing the economy. So you had in the communist period there was much more frozen economy, a rigid economy, and the forms of competition that took place was primarily in informal markets and barter trade. Now, and this in this situation, it was quite simple for some players to position themselves for long-term gain, because the most profitable form of corruption is, of course, the form of corruption that leads to market power. So you can not only profit from one contract, but many contracts. And if you and Russia had so large state revenues that they could privatize. However, for those who wanted to buy them, they could, well, turning around a little bit, for those who wanted to sell them, it would be much easier to get a high price if they not only sold the assets, but also sold them with the market power intact. That means if they could sell them in a way so that they would not be exposed to competition right away, but they would be operating as the monopolies they were before privatization, they would be, of course, they would be much more profitable, and if there were owners, they would be much richer. So, and this is a problem that we see not only in former Soviet area, but also in Latin America, where they privatized a lot, and the payments for the assets was much higher, both above the table and below the table, if the companies could be sold with market power. And that means promises of restricted entry for a certain period, and maybe also subsidies, and a lot of benefits. But the only difference was that the owners, the private owners, would benefit and not the societies. So this has been an extremely damaging process. We saw also tendencies to, in Western European countries, there was a lot of privatization. Second half of the 20th century, and many of those assets were also sold with market power for the sake of securing more state revenues. Whether there were corruption involved or not, I don't know, but also the size of bribes, of course, will be higher for those who sell the assets if they sell state-owned entities with market power. Now, this is a drawing from Ukraine, where I know this is a significant problem. Now, a third factor that I think can be important to understand how these historical aspects contribute to explain corruption today is actually the fact that there was that these are socialist societies. So citizens expected to have things from the state. They expected utility provision, electricity. They expected that the state was responsible for providing a lot of things. So even if this situation after the Soviet Union, the countries, in all the countries, they were very poor, extremely poor, and they simply could not offer the benefits, the public benefits that people expected. So we saw, when I look at the figures, we see that there was a very, very much corruption in health, for example. So why in health? And that, I think, is the reason that those who worked in the health sector, they hardly got any wages. And that is still a problem, but it is on a decrease, but it's still a problem that wages are so low in many places, while people still expect the state to be responsible for offering services. Now, from an economic perspective, we would say that if people pay bribes for the services because the state doesn't offer them, why not just liberalize? Why not privatize those health sectors and let the bribe function as a formal price? But in a socialist, and even in my own Norway is also a socialist societies in many ways, and we in a society where citizens expect these benefits to be offered by the state, it's very unpopular for politicians just to say, now we will privatize all of this and you pay formal prices instead of bribes. So that is politically a tricky thing to do. And but from an economic perspective, that would make sense. Simply liberalize the problem, make the bribes legal by saying these are formal prices. But so that is a quite fascinating issue and real concern, of course. The fourth and last factor that I think may contribute to explain some of today's problems is that citizens in former Soviet countries, former Soviet region, was not used to consider the state as working for us. So in a real established democracy, citizens would think of state institutions as something that as obviously are accountable, that they should be accountable, and that there should be a lot of reactions if they are not. In a society where you had where you did not have a democracy, citizens were more used to think of the state as a threat, as something they could be spied on, and something, if they could just be left alone and not bothered, then everything would be fine. So that is a completely different state-citizen relationship. And I think some of that made it much easier for some of the countries to continue the authoritarian line. And for the leaders, of course, if they are not expected to be held accountable to the people, then it's much easier for them to act as if they are not accountable. So I think that has made it slightly easier for some to be corrupt as well. These four factors, I think they make sense from an economic perspective, but you may well disagree, and you should tell me. We can have some discussion about that in a little while. But when we look at the development corruption causalities, and we think of to what extent will this explain developments in the region, economic developments, that's extremely difficult to say, because there are so many other factors influencing society. And one of the interesting features of foreign companies is actually that they are demanding professional business climate, so there can be a causality from well-functioning markets and development to anti-corruption. It's not only that if we only deal with corruption, we will get development. So this causality is very difficult to verify. Now, if we look at some data, I think these, if you keep in mind these factors, I think, and you look at these, I don't know if you can see the names of the countries, if it's too small. What you see, this is the biggest business survey internationally. It's done by the World Bank. They've done the same survey for a very large number of years, 130,000 companies included or so. And you see that some countries have much higher bribery incidents, well, as reported by the companies, than others. And the countries with the biggest problems, according to this survey, is Ukraine, Tajikistan, Moldova, the Kyrgyz Republic, Kazakhstan, and Albania also have big problems. And you see Russia is coming out quite well in this survey. This is similar same data set. It's just that it's percent of firms expected to give gifts to public officials to get things done. So there are some different responses, but the same countries are seen as particularly challenged. What I think have been striking when I look at this region is that many of the countries have been performing much better on doing business indicators. Many of the countries have taken important steps to make it much easier for foreign companies to enter the market and operate in the market. So several of the countries in the region have really made a jump on this doing business indicators. So apparently, including Russia, and apparently there has been much easier for foreign companies to enter and operate, and that helps a lot for competition and of course access to goods and qualities and so on. So it's an important part of the economy. When it comes to democracy, the picture is a bit more mixed, and several of the countries struggle when it comes to democracy, which we think is quite linked to problems with corruption. I just want to make you aware of the data from this World Justice Project, which provides quite detailed information about the function of the law enforcement systems in countries, and they go into details of what factors. So there are some 8 categories of factors, and then 8, 9 subgroups of each of them. So you can read quite detailed about reports about the situation in countries, apparently there are some serious problems in Russia. I will summarize those in a little while. So yes, now. So when I look at Russia in particular and consider what kind of anti-corruption progress have we seen, what is the status right now? The impression as an outsider who does not really know Russia quite well, my impression is that the market-related institutions have improved in many ways. There have been reforms in Russia every year for the benefit of private players, and these, I have a report from the World Bank where these reforms have been listed, and I can show you if you're interested afterwards. Now, when it comes to civil servants, there have been several wage increases that may reduce the problem of petty corruption, but that is very difficult to say because the wage level is still very low. But at least there is some progress in that respect. There is corporate criminal liability in Russia, and there has been a significant increase in the number of corporations that have been held liable for corruption. And there are also a real risk for public officials to be held liable for corruption. And there's also now competition authority, and there are investigators who do a proper job. One of the challenges when it comes to anti-corruption is actually the lack of financial oversight. Huge amounts of money are taken out of the country. That's really some serious theft going on when I look at these figures, and that probably happens at high level of, well, I don't know. We don't know exactly who is responsible for this. But it cannot be explained in trade, it cannot be explained in investments. And we cannot conclude that this reflects corruption or theft, but it is likely. A further concern from Russia is that it is extremely difficult to be a whistleblower. It's very, very difficult to report suspected corruption, and citizens don't dare to do it. That is the report that I read. And there's no good, trustworthy whistleblower channels. There's, you should tell me if I'm wrong, but there's, according to what I read, there's not a good ombudsman function in place, and freedom of speech is restricted in many ways. So that is something. This is, and again, this is something I simply read out of the internet reports I have not been in Russia and studied this, so you should tell me if this is the wrong impression. Now, when it comes to rule of law, I'm a bit surprised to see that there are still so serious challenges in this, because Russia is a country that should be able to introduce a functional law enforcement system. But the report in this Rule of Justice report and several other reports on enforcement show that this is actually a significant problem. I expect it will change, because even if you have leaders who are not really accountable, they still benefit from a functional law enforcement system. So I think that there will be progress on that area, and I'm really surprised to see that it's not better than it is. The biggest problem is that there are several reports indicating authoritarian regime, checks and balances at the political level not in function, and democratic freedom constrained. And this is not new for you. One of the things that I would like to discuss with you, so we are turning to discussion. I'm sorry if I'm spending too much time. But I want to turn to the discussion about what can we do about this? What can international players do? If that is the biggest problem, what does it make sense? How can international players collaborate with players in Russia for the sake of improving the situation? And I have studied foreign players in anti-corruption, and they have different functions. I don't know how they could work in Russia. That's what you can tell me. But we see that civil society play crucial roles in pressuring for reforms. They do so in all categories of countries. They reveal information that lead to change. There are also, when I look at the OECD, which is basically an arena for government representatives to come together and talk. Also, when I look at such arenas, the information from civil society matters very much. And but what I find extremely fascinating is also the role of firms. Companies are drivers for change. They are more important drivers for change in many places than the governments themselves. Many companies demand a professional business climate. When things are not functional, they complain about it. Governments, foreign governments, are often too worried. They are too worried about raising such issues with other governments. But companies, especially the large companies, can be very straightforward and say, this is not acceptable. We cannot operate here if you have a system like this. If you take bribes in customs, we cannot establish a company in this region. You know, that kind of signals lead to change. And I think it's a very good signal for Russia that there's more openness and more trade in the sense. So that is, even if it may be hard to believe, but it may actually lead to differences. Development banks offer loans. They do have conditionality. We call it conditionality on integrity. They have strict demands for institutions, oversight, and so on, anti-corruption, and so on. But they are banks, and they want to lend money. So the impact has not always been as strong as those who work in those institutions hope for. And the OECD and the United States, the United Nations are basically meeting places for diplomats, extremely important in that respect. They appear dysfunctional because it's so difficult to reach conclusions, but they are extremely important for the sake of creating consensus around what solutions should look like. When it comes to the sanctions on a country, I find that extremely difficult. That's a very difficult thing, that large countries impose sanctions on another country. And I think that one criteria should be that it is actually desired by the people in the country. We saw that in South Africa, the sanctions against South Africa because of apartheid. That in that situation, it was wanted by by the people. The black people in South Africa wanted those sanctions, and they did change the country. But in many countries, it is an extremely complicated tool that we should be careful to use. So I think I end it here. This looks like a very naive drawing, but I really mean it. This is quite important that given the tensions at the higher political level, it is really, really important that there is dialogue like this and friendship and communication at the level of people. Thank you.